Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on protesting segregation in interstate travel, the Freedom Riders. In this conversation, we're going to look at the Freedom Riders, the origin of the Freedom Ride movement. We're going to focus on a particular trip from Washington, D.C. to Birmingham, Alabama, then from Birmingham to Montgomery and Montgomery to Jackson. And then we're going to focus on the federal response to the Freedom Rides and then look at the results of the Freedom Rides. So I want to begin by asking this question: why Freedom Rides? What does that mean? Why would people board buses? Black and white Americans board buses and ride into the Deep South. What was going on that was a problem. Why would this particular form of protest be chosen? Walter Brueggemann, in his book The Prophetic Imagination, said, "The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. The alternative consciousness to be nurtured, on the one hand, serves to criticize in dismantling the dominant consciousness. On the other hand, that alternative consciousness to be nurtured serves to energize persons and communities by its promise of another time and situation toward which the community of faith may move." And so I use this quote because the Freedom Riders are going to do exactly what Brueggemann is talking about. The prophetic imagination challenges the dominant culture around us, and it evokes a consciousness and perception that alternatives can exist. There can be something better. And in this case, Black Americans would travel on buses from one state to another, and when they reached states where segregation existed, they would not be permitted to be served in the terminals, to use restrooms, and all sorts of other things within this system. And so these Freedom Riders are challenging this system, and they are moving us towards a new and better consciousness and a new and better community, but that involves dismantling the old way of doing things, the old and dominant consciousness, which we will see is going to create conflict. So the background to the Freedom Riders activity and the origins of it. In Boynton versus Virginia in 1960, the Supreme Court extended another decision, the Morgan, Virginia decision, to include all terminal accommodations in interstate travel. So essentially the ruling by the government of the United States in the Supreme Court was that travelers of all races could board a bus and travel from one city to another, and even in the Deep South, and expect to be treated equally in the terminals and in the accommodations with regard to interstate travel. But this was not the case in the Deep South. And so James Farmer, the leader of CORE, called for volunteers to do Freedom Rides to test this ruling. And that occurred in March of 1961. And the plan was to test the Jim Crow segregation laws in terminal restaurants, waiting rooms, and restrooms. But the real target, and this is really important, was the administration in Washington, D.C. The civil rights leaders informed President Kennedy that they intended to commit civil disobedience in these terminal accommodations, and they were attempting to get federal action because they knew on their own they couldn't change this, but they needed the federal government to back up its court ruling, back up its own Supreme Court ruling, and take action. So the Freedom Riders, as you saw from that map, there's many different parts of the country that this was going on. Most of them departed from Washington, D.C., and we're going to look at the most famous of the Freedom Rides, which started in Washington, D.C. and headed to Birmingham and then Montgomery and then um, Jackson, Mississippi. Um, the Washington, D.C. Departure went pretty smoothly. It went through Richmond and Petersburg, Virginia, and Lynchburg, Virginia without incident. In Charlotte, North Carolina, one of the Freedom Riders, Charles Perkins, was arrested for what we call a shoe-in, which was his attempt to go into a place where people could be accommodated with having their shoes shine. He was arrested and acquitted. The trip moved on to Rock Hill, South Carolina. In Rock Hill, South Carolina, John Lewis was assaulted for entering a white waiting room. He was clubbed and beaten, and the police intervened and allowed the riders to enter that room. But in Anniston, Alabama, we have pictured here that a mob smashed the windows and tires of a bus. The police helped the bus escape, but then the mob followed the bus, attacked it, and bombed it. And this is a picture of the bus on fire. Um, Later, Walter Bergman was attacked at a station when a second bus arrived and received permanent brain damage as a result of that encounter. Once the new buses reached Birmingham, the police commissioner of Birmingham, Alabama, who we'll talk about later, Eugene Bull Connor, essentially allowed the mob that was waiting for them 15 minutes to attack the riders, and without any kind of law enforcement intervention. And so a really bloody scene emerges in Birmingham, Alabama. And ultimately, this part of this particular trip is stalled. Some of the riders fly to New Orleans to complete the trip. They had trouble finding a driver to complete the trip, and actually, this group is going to sort of dissolve, and a new group is going to be formed to complete the trip. But this leg obviously started out good and ended up to be very violent in the end. From Birmingham, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, the student movement, SNCC actually took over the protest movement and took over this ride and found volunteers. It took some time to find a driver, but ultimately they continued their journey and headed to Montgomery, Alabama. There was a police escort with helicopters provided to this leg of the trip, but that escort disappeared once they got to Montgomery. And once they got in the city, they got to the terminal. Again, a mob attacked the riders with lead pipes and baseball bats. John Lewis, who is a famous civil rights leader and then later, for many years, U.S. Congressman, was beaten unconscious. And while he was laying in a pool of blood, his own blood, he was served an injunction for his participation in for breaking the law, essentially. James Zwerg, a white exchange student who was part of this trip, was beaten by the mob and had his teeth kicked out. And there are photos and there are movie reels of this, all that are really sobering and interesting to look at. You actually have spectators with their children on their shoulders watching these events unfold. So it's really critically important. I picked this picture of James Zwerg out because this picture of him after he was beaten and in the hospital um, it becomes a national headline. And this is really important because it's interesting that it's a white person that becomes a national headline, but it also is interesting that it's going to evoke a lot of national sentiment for the Freedom Riders, a lot of sympathy for what they're trying to accomplish. So it's very important that there are both black and white participants in this particular protest movement. It's also important to understand kind of the psychology of white people and how they would maybe sympathize with a person of their own race being part of this and being beaten. And that's an interesting thing to contemplate. Kennedy then, as this national sympathy grew, responded. President Kennedy called on the Alabama officials to meet their responsibilities and vowed that the United States would meet its responsibilities. He requested that Alabama citizens refrain from violence, and he ordered the United States Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy, which is his brother, to take all necessary steps to deal with this violence. And so the Attorney General pressured the KKK and other typically violent groups not to interfere. And he also sent U.S. Marshals to Alabama to assist the local authorities. And this is going to be an important new element in our conversation as we start to see the law enforcement officials being used to protect the protesters and to sometimes protect, I should say, the protesters, and sometimes not. But you're going to have this kind of new interjection of law enforcement support at times for the process of the freedom rides. So at Montgomery, Alabama, while the Freedom Riders were there, Martin Luther King announced that there would be a mass rally on May 21st at Ralph Abernathy's First Baptist Church, a prominent black church in Montgomery. A white mob actually attacked the church. They surrounded the church that was just filled with civil rights leaders and supporters of the movement, most of them black. A white mob surrounded the church and basically attacked the church and held these people hostage for a period of time until federal marshals were called in, federal marshals arrived to protect the church. The governor of Alabama then ordered the National Guard and troopers to assist the marshals in protecting the church. And so, again, you see this new element of law enforcement support for what's going on with regard to the civil rights movement. But then on the other side, 3 weeks after this event, Henry Lyon Jr., probably the most prominent white Baptist pastor in Montgomery, spoke to the Citizens Council and said of Montgomery, Alabama, and said God created segregation. That all of this that we're seeing is a result of people just not accepting the reality that God made segregation, that that's the way it's supposed to be, and that we are on good ground whenever we defend segregation, that it is the best way and it is God's way. The next leg of the Freedom Ride that we're looking at was from Montgomery, Alabama to Jackson, Mississippi. On that leg, the National Guard escorted the riders. Airplanes and helicopters were overhead. Mississippi law enforcement took over at the state line. And so we see this new image of law enforcement being there to protect civil rights protesting. Once they got to their destination of Jackson, Mississippi, the Freedom Riders were not molested there. There was no violence, but they were arrested. President Kennedy and the Governor Eastland of Mississippi had made a deal that if there was no mob violence, the federal government would not contest the arrests of the Freedom Riders. And so they were arrested when they tried to enter a white cafeteria. They were found guilty and fined. They were given 2 months suspended sentences, but the riders chose not to pay the fines and to actually go to jail. And so this movement, as we see the different pieces of this, by the end of summer, over 1,000 people had participated in freedom rides throughout the country. And so in 1961, we have this tremendous movement that is going to challenge a very simple thing, the ability to just go into a bus terminal and be served like everyone else and go into a restroom and use restroom facilities. A very simple thing, and if we just consider the magnitude of it and the amount of conflict that is caused by this simple act, you will just understand the depth of the problem that segregation, 100 years of segregation had created as we try to move past it. So how would you expect the federal government to respond at this point in our conversation? What's next? What's the role of the government? You have this situation. You have the Supreme Court has said these terminals need to be open to all people of all races. And you have these places that are just refusing to do it, and you have this violence, you have this protest. What's the response of the federal government? What's the proper response? What's the Christian response? Um, what's the response of justice? Esau McCaulley, in his book Reading While Black, wrote, "Kingship in the Bible is linked to justice. We see this in the royal Psalms. According to the psalmist, the king, who reflects God's own justice, is on the side of the poor and disinherited. Jesus' kingly sonship is inseparable from God's justice because Israel's king cares for the poor." I think it's a very interesting thing to think about. You know, the Bible is about justice, and governments in the Bible, God says, are there to provide justice, to take care of those who are suffering injustice, but to also reward those who are doing good and punish those who are doing evil. And so, as you think about that in the context of the federal government and what their role is, what would the federal response be? Well, in a biblical sense, it would be to seek justice for those who are being treated unjustly. And so we consider that and consider whether or not government is living up to that. Sometimes government does live up to that, and sometimes it does not. So the federal response to the freedom rides in the end was for the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1961 to order that interstate carriers and terminals must display signs stating seating without regard to race and color. They banned interstate carriers from using terminals that practice segregation. So the really key thing here is the Interstate Commerce Commission is going to exercise some really significant authority here. And they're going to say essentially these terminals have to allow people to be served like anybody else in people of any race. And then they banned interstate carriers from using terminals that practice segregation. So if you are a bus company, an interstate bus company, you cannot use terminals. You can't go to cities where the terminals are practicing segregation. So that's a lot of pressure from the federal government, and that's a very significant ruling in support of integrating these bus terminals. Robert Kennedy, then, the Attorney General, urged civil rights leaders to shift their emphasis from violence-provoking direct action like the freedom rides. And I think that's important to understand that in his context, he saw the freedom rides as evoking violence. This direct action created problems for the federal government and forced their hand. So he said, why don't you talk more about voter registration? Why don't you shift your emphasis from direct action to voter registration? And then two civil rights groups, SNCC and CORE, responded to the government's response by developing a two-pronged approach: direct action and voter registration. So they took Kennedy's advice and they did start to move in the direction of registering voters. That, by the way, is also going to turn very violent and provoke a violent response, as we will see later. But they're going to continue their direct action campaign. So some really significant decisions, some really interesting things to think about here. The government responds, but then Robert Kennedy says, how about you don't do this kind of stuff anymore, which is the exact thing that caused the federal government to respond. Kennedy saying, don't do this anymore. How about you just move towards something that would provoke less of a response from people? But in the end, that's not going to be true anyway. So as we move to the third section of our conversation here, what results would you expect from the freedom rides? So these events, 1,000 Americans, white and black, get on buses to protest the fact that people are not being treated equally in these bus terminals. And we saw the violence, and we saw the federal response, and we saw all these different aspects of that. But we want to take a look at kind of like the results of this. What is going, as we look into the future, what are the results? What would you expect the results of something like this to be? Austin Channing Brown, in her book I'm Still Here, wrote, I stand in the legacy of all that Black Americans have already accomplished in their resistance, in their teachings, in their voices, in their faith, and I work toward a world unseen, currently unimaginable. I use this quote because the for some reason the freedom rides really speak to me when I think about the simple thing that was being denied to people that all people should have, the simple protest and the violent response that came out of it. It's so sobering. And then if you think about it in terms of what are the results of something like this going to be, Brown is saying that she's a black woman, contemporary to this time, in the legacy of what black Americans have already accomplished in their resistance, teachings, voices, faith. I work toward a world unseen, currently unimaginable. The truth is that results of just actions, the results of courage, the results of doing the right thing, often are not seen in this world in tangible ways. And sometimes they're even unimaginable. We can't even imagine what this world looks like. And sadly, as I do this recording, um, almost a half century after, more than a half century after these events that we're looking at, we're still looking toward a world unseen, unimaginable, where, yes, you can go into any restaurant and be served. I know that, whether you're a minority or not. But there are still really difficult problems within our society that we're still trying to deal with, and we're still trying to figure out. And I think Brown really speaks to that, but that does not lessen the importance of the pieces of the struggle that have been put in place by people throughout these different periods, doing the right thing, having the courage to stand up for what's right. So the results of the freedom rides are very interesting. Number one, the freedom rides demonstrated that victory in the Deep South was possible. That's really important because up to this point, up to 1961, there are few really clear victories in the Deep South. Secondly, and sadly, the freedom rides intensified white resistance. And that's important to understand as well. Thirdly, the freedom rides enlisted whites and non-Southerners in direct action. Um, More whites and more non-Southerners are going to become aware of what's going on in the South through the freedom rides, and they're going to become involved. That's going to be very important. Fourth, Southern officials began engaging in peaceful defiance because they realized that they could get away with mass arrests, and something we haven't talked about that occurred in Albany, Georgia. and where the officials there just decided they were going to handle the situation by simply arresting people, but requiring their community to stay peaceful. And when they did that, the federal government didn't intervene and the status quo could be maintained. So you see this development of an understanding by segregationists that if they stayed peaceful and simply arrested people for their civil rights activities or civil rights protests, they could really maintain the status quo in their society. And then fifth, there's a very important response by civil rights leaders uh, who were encouraged to then court violent responses to get the necessary federal response. So something like Albany, what happened in Albany, and what happened in Jackson, Mississippi at the end of the Freedom Ride, becomes something that for civil rights leaders becomes problematic because now they're protesting, being arrested, no violence, and the result of that is essentially status quo. And so civil rights leaders are beginning to recognize that they are going to need to do things to court violence in order to get the federal government to respond so that the status quo can be disrupted and something new made. So the federal laws that are in place that need to be enforced will actually be enforced by the hand of the federal government. So in this conversation on protesting segregation and interstate travel, we've looked at the Freedom Riders, we looked at the origins of the movement, and then one particular trip, as we said, there were many of them. We looked at the trip from Washington to Birmingham and saw how it started out peacefully and then ended up very violently. And then we saw that kind of transition period in Birmingham to Montgomery, where the federal government began to get involved, and we start to see some law enforcement support. But then we see violence in Montgomery again. Then we see the Montgomery to Jackson, a part of the trip being peaceful. The local officials recognizing that if they protect the riders and simply arrest them when they commit their civil disobedience, but it's peaceful, the federal government will allow that to occur. And then we saw the federal response to the Freedom Rides, the Interstate Commerce Commission's ruling that these terminals are not going to be used anymore if they are not integrated. And then finally, we looked at the results of the Freedom Rides. Some questions to consider from our conversation. Did God create segregation? As the pastor of First Baptist Church stated, um, did God create segregation? Is there any validity to that concept at all? Are we supposed to be separate? I think it's a really important question for us to really dive deep into and think through and to be able to discuss. Secondly, was the federal response to the Freedom Rides biblical justice? Why or why not? And then lastly, what are the moral implications of provoking violence to achieve justice? Because that's clearly where the civil rights movement is starting to head now. Thanks for joining this conversation today. God bless you and have a great day.